With the release of Deltarune Chapter 5, the idea of the aborted weird route, as it is often called, being a bigger deal than originally thought has started to grow real momentum. Before then, the only real hint for a possible third route was the existence of the Twisted Sword, a currently unobtainable item that is listed in the item fusion menu in Castletown. To craft this sword, 2 items are required, the Pure Crystal and the Thorn Ring. We currently have no clear idea about what the Pure Crystal is, but the most plausible option as of now is that it's something that will be created from the Shadow Crystals collected in the first 5 chapters of the game, probably by Sean. As for the Thorn Ring, as you likely know, it's the item required to let Noelle cast Snowgrave in the Weir Route version of Chapter 2. The weapon seems to have a trance effect, according to the Chapter 5 fusion menu, though according to the stats of the item in the files, the effect is actually trance down, whatever it means. This could also be subject to change, however. In any case, considering that the effect of the Thorn Ring is also trance, this seems significant. However, once Noelle leaves the party, we lose the Thorn Ring from our inventory, so there were 2 main options being considered. Either at a certain point during the weird route we would get the ring back, which wasn't that crazy to believe at the time, or the Twisted Sword was an item obtainable only by aborting the weird route in Chapter 2 after obtaining the ring, but before freezing Birdley. This second option was interesting because it opened up the possibility of seeing significant variations in the story in an aborted weird route, mainly because, considering the items required to craft the Twisted Sword, it was hard to believe that it would not be an important item of some kind. That said, there were no more real hints that something else existed outside of the main and the weird route, so it was always an interesting but highly speculative theory. However, with the release of Chapter 5, this has changed dramatically. The weird route of Chapter 5 ends without entering the Dark World, and is also skipping Chapter 6 altogether. This means that, as far as we know, it is impossible to obtain all the Shadow Crystals in a weird route, and so it looks like the Twisted Sword is indeed an item only craftable in an aborted weird route. This gives much more strength to the idea of a third route being present in Chapter 6. This is not the only reason why a third route seems much more likely than before, however. There are also very important narrative implications for why its existence seems not only likely but almost inevitable, and it mainly revolves around the fact that aborting the weird route in Chapter 5 is strange, to say the least. Much more than how it was in previous chapters, to the point that many believe that we did not actually go back to the main route, like it would happen in Chapter 2 or Chapter 4. There are multiple reasons to believe so. First of all, this jingle. In Chapter 2 and Chapter 4, there are multiple instances in which you can interrupt the weird route, and in any of those, if you did, that jingle would play. However, in Chapter 5 it just doesn't. This cannot be a mistake, it is absolutely intentional. First of all, because if this was a mistake, it would be an egregious one, but also because it would have been patched already, or at least I would hope so. So this seems to imply that in this instance, something slightly different has happened compared to the previous chapters. Now, let's analyze what exactly happens after we don't proceed enough. We seemingly jump back to the main route, and the scene with Noelle and Susie looks basically the same, but the context is vastly different. Susie is very worried for Chris when she leaves them alone with Noelle. She knows that something very wrong is happening, and that Chris is not fine. And something is wrong with Noelle as well. Their date alone went well on the surface, but even Susie realized that she was behaving strangely sometimes. She was more pushy than usual, and especially her offering that huge sum of money was very worrying. And yet, she lets them talk alone in the midst of all her doubts about the situation. Later, after failing to go over the lake, we see sections of the scene between Noelle and Susie. We don't see the full one, but these sections are exactly the same as in the normal route. We can assume that the entire scene played out without any change. Technically, as of the most recent patch, there is one different Noelle sprite, though this could be a mistake at this point. Previously there was one more significant sprite difference, but it was patched, so I don't think that we should consider these differences specifically. That said, we don't really need to do that. We don't need a different sprite to understand that when Noelle says she is too weak to escape, the implications are significantly heavier here than in the normal route. She is putting on a mask, trying to behave in the correct way for the moment, but clearly that is not fully working. Nothing changed, and Noelle is just a Noelle. She keeps telling herself on the inside, and I think that Susie noticed it. Later, when she comes back with ice cream, she is significantly less enthusiastic compared to the normal route. She is still full of doubt. She doesn't know what to believe. Noelle said she liked her and she's happy about it, but why did she need to talk alone with Chris? Why was their hair wet? Why is Chris seemingly suffering so much? Something is wrong with both of them, and she sees that. But by the end of the hot spring scene, later in the Dark World, she wants to believe that everything wrong is done, that she can move on from those doubts. But I don't think she is completely convinced yet. There clearly was something going on, and Noelle is hiding something to her. Chris too. All of this seems to imply that while Noelle tried to convince herself again that it was all a dream, this time it was much harder than before. The chapter 4 scene in the bedroom is a turning point. She can't ignore what happened that easily. Chris literally read her mind multiple times, from her point of view, at least. That's the reason why we all believe that we were locked in the Weir Route by that point. And even assuming that she managed to completely convince herself that it was all fake, the experience still scarred her. She still almost drowned for nothing. She couldn't reach the other side of the lake. Noelle is hanging on by a thread. She is trying so hard to go back to her normal life because she could not escape it with Chris. But what would happen if she learned that, without a doubt, Dark World is real, that Snowgrave is real, that what she did to Birdley is real, that it actually snowed? The ending of chapter 5 heavily sets up the idea that Noelle will return as a playable party member in whatever the new Dark World will be. I believe it's going to be the Holiday House, but it's not really relevant to the discussion. Now, I can see her not actually going to Castletown. The way they showed us the decorations being put up, to me, screams that they will not be of much use. That said, considering the situation with Rudy and considering that everything is pointing towards chapter 6 being the Holiday Family chapter, it's not hard to believe that she will enter a Dark World. Also, it is very interesting that the Deltarune's team has been adding unused Noelle comments to various pieces of equipment. This has been going on ever since chapter 3. Why would they do that, if not to prepare for a future moment in the story in which she enters the party again? Granted, this could be for chapter 7 side B, but I don't think she will be in the mood for such comments by then. For all these reasons, I believe that everything is pointing towards Noelle entering the chapter 6 Dark World. Maybe she will even create it herself. But as I said before, I think that if this happens, after interrupting the Weir Route in chapter 5, she would realize that everything actually happened, and I don't see how this cannot change the way the story plays out. I literally cannot see a way out of a very different chapter 6, and if so, I think that would qualify as a third route. Now, how does the Twisted Sword fit in this third route? I have no clue whatsoever, but it doesn't really matter at this point. Now, all of this means that I'm convinced that the third route will be present, right? It's undeniable. It's so clearly laid out. And yet, despite everything I just said, despite the fact that a seemingly important item like the Twisted Sword is, as far as we know, only obtainable by interrupting the weir route, and despite the fact that it feels inevitable that if Noelle learns about Dark Worlds at this point, she would go back to her weir route self, I still am not convinced that believing in a third route is fully reasonable, and it is driving me insane. First of all, we should consider the fact that the weir route can be stopped in multiple sections of the game, as I mentioned earlier. There are multiple stopping points, but the three main ones are in Chapter 2, after getting the ring but before freezing Birdly, in Chapter 4, and in Chapter 5. The first stopping point is interesting because, as far as we know, it's the clearest path towards the Twisted Sword, since the ring remains in your inventory. That's the reason why some people think that this hypothetical third route exists, but requires stopping here. That said, considering how much narrative weight interrupting the weird route in Chapter 5 has, I think that if a third route exists, it's after stopping in Chapter 5. And since the worst thing that Chris and Noelle do in this instance is freeze a few Darkeners, I think that Noelle wouldn't be affected that much if she learns the truth. They would need to come up with a way to not give us the Twisted Sword, I assume, but I think this is very doable. Chapter 4, on the other hand, is more complicated. Because, sure, the lake scene didn't happen. The mind reading didn't happen. Chris says that it was all a prank, and Noelle comes down and finally convinces herself that it was all a dream. But if she learns that it wasn't a dream, well, we end up in a similar situation to what we discussed before for Chapter 5, though to a lesser degree. I would assume that Noelle would still feel quite shocked by the realization of what she did to Birdly. Also, I could see her reaching the same conclusions about herself that led her to do what she did in Chapter 5 Weird Route. That said, she does not put the ring on again, the effect of which in the light world isn't clear, so that may be something. Considering this, should we assume that there are 2 different aborted weird routes? Maybe even 3 if we count stopping in Chapter 2? That is ridiculous, as far as I'm concerned. That is way too many. There is no way that so many different paths could exist in the game and be finished in a timely manner. But then, how do you handle aborting in Chapter 4 specifically? It can't be the same as Chapter 5, the lake scene is way too impactful. But can it be nothing? Or nothing major? I am not sure. Maybe? That said, even if we assume that only by interrupting the route in Chapter 5 we can get an actual different route, my main issue still remains. I don't know how reasonable it is to expect Toby Fox and his team to develop a third version of the story when Deltarune is already taking quite a lot of time. And this is not like how the Weir route has been up until now. That is, with very little actual unique content, mainly new dialogue and very few unique scenes. I am fairly certain that up until now the Weir route did not take as much development time as some people think. But now it's different. Now we are entering the endgame. Chapter 7 Side B seems like it's going to be completely different, or at least close to being completely different. And I believe that the third route in Chapter 6 would be the same at this point if it goes in the direction that many of us are thinking. How could it not? If it didn't, it wouldn't even count as an actual route. On top of that, I think that this hypothetical third route would need to end in Chapter 6. Otherwise, Chapter 7 would have 3 entirely different versions, which seems, again, unreasonable. How much time would it require at this point to develop 3 versions of Chapter 7? I just cannot believe that it is something that they would want to do. After all, even if we know now, through the recently updated 7B page in the Deltarune website, that they have been working on Chapter 7 Side B for a while, they haven't started Chapter 7 proper yet, or at most they barely did, according to the June newsletter. And if we assume that the third version of Chapter 7 is planned, then either they've been working on that as well, which sounds unlikely, or they need to do both before releasing the end of the game. And how much time would that take? That said, having our first ending in Chapter 6 would be a bit strange. even if we don't believe that there is going to be only one ending, which would complicate things even more. Neither option is completely satisfying to me. On top of everything, Toby has stated multiple times that Chapter 6 will be a shorter chapter to develop, and I don't think that a significantly different version of Chapter 6 would help with that. I feel like I am stuck between having a hard time imagining a way that the story could work in a satisfying way in a post-Chapter 5 aborted weird route without significant differences, and finding hard to believe that they are making an entirely different version of Chapter 6 and possibly 7 as well, that is not confirmed in any way. I'm in this weird limbo of feeling like a third route is narratively an inevitability, but also practically impossible. So, as of now, the two options I believe are the most plausible are option A, the third route actually exists. Noelle will learn about the Dark World, will realize that everything actually happened, and this will cause significant variations to the point that calling it a third route will feel justified. Or option B, Noelle will never enter the Dark World again, and she will never know the truth about them. This would solve all the narrative issues by skipping them entirely. However, I find it quite hard to believe that Noelle will never get involved with the Knight, who is seemingly a holiday, probably death in some way, and with Carol's plan. Also, I don't know how they would handle the Twisted Sword. After how significant the aborted weird route is in Chapter 5, having the item locked to an aborted Chapter 2 would be quite strange. What would be the point of the item? Of course, there is a secret option, number 3. I am just not smart enough to imagine a way to not derail the story and still make it satisfying, or a way to make a third route in a reasonable amount of time. I don't know what will happen at the end of the day. I just don't want to be disappointed if I believe too much in a story path that was never promised to us. And to be clear, I want to stress this before the end of the video, I don't need the third route to exist. If Chapter 6 comes out and the aborted weird route contains only minimal changes, but it works well with the story, I will be more than fine. It's not like the game necessarily needs a third route. Toby seems quite confident in the pacing of the story by the end, and we can do nothing but believe him at this point. He definitely knows more than us. Of course, if it exists, it's even better, but we already have a phenomenal main route plus the weird route. The main point of this video was just to discuss the possibility of a third route and how, as things stand right now, I see it as the only solution to the narrative that's been built up, plus an answer to all the strange details present in the aborted Chapter 5, but also to discuss how a third route, as I'm imagining it, would possibly require way too much time to make. These two ideas have been fighting in my head for more than a month at this point, and I had to get them out there somehow. Well, I guess that the only thing I can do right now is wait, hope, and trust the dog.